Okay, so I think we're live streaming now, everyone. Welcome. I think we're still waiting for the chief, but maybe we should go ahead and get started. Again, the meeting is being recorded and live streamed at the moment. If you want to ask questions, I ask you to raise your hands, especially tonight since Kim is not here yet. And with that, I will kick it off to John for the welcome.
Thank you, Tammy. Again, welcome everyone. It's right now, let's see what time is it? It is 5:03. I call the meeting to order. I want to thank you, the board and staff, and for people who are joining us tonight and coming together. I will take us through a breathing exercise. And before I do that, I want to just read a couple of statements. I'd like to invite you to join me into a center exercise, centering our conversation tonight. First, I will read a statement and I will ask you to join me in a breathing exercise to help bring focus and thoughtfulness to our conversation of today. Today, we convene to listen and to learn from each other through reflection and discussion. As we reevaluate and improve our public safety practices, we elevate our voices, the voices and the experience of the community who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by inequitable systems. We thank all those who have advocated and worked on dismantling injustice in Tigard and our broader community. We build off of their efforts and create more equitable and just outcome for people of all background and abilities. The purpose of our meeting is to develop our understanding of current public safety in structures, practices, and procedures, identify and eliminate institutional racism within Tigard's public institutions by centering equity and racial justice, bring forward the concern and experience of ourselves and our community, bring recommendation to the city leadership to improve the lived experience of all people in Tigard. Now, we would do a breathing exercise together. You may turn off your camera for this portion. Close your eyes or gaze softly downward. Feel the chair under your legs. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your hand in your lap. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your feet on the ground. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Slowly open your eyes and begin to breathe normally. Thank you all for participating and creating space with me. With that, welcome Tammy, and Tammy's going to help facilitate tonight's meeting. So we'll ask Tammy to do the roll call for us.
Great. Hi, everybody. Officer Nunn. Shelby Rohala.
Here.
Michael McDonald. Michael McDonald. I thought he had joined. Emilio Calderon. Liz Newton.
Here.
John Trin.
Present.
Jimmy Brown.
Here.
Lee Landers.
Here.
Patty Lofgren.
I am here.
Justin Lowe.
Present.
Danny Rauda.
Here.
Valerie Sasaki.
Present.
Sean Schuldreier.
Here.
Nick Jarmer.
Here, thank you.
Jeff Mott.
Here.
And roll call is complete. Oh, sorry, Chief.
I am here.
There we go. And I think roll call is complete.
Thank you.
Oh, just briefly, I'd like to acknowledge that Judge Michael O'Brien is also at the meeting.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Judge. Okay. Thank you for taking, let's see. Okay, thank you for taking the time to speak with the Public Safety Advisory Board. I think tonight there were no written, public speaking comment tonight, but there was one written comment that was sent to the board. So tonight, no community member has joined us to speak. The public comments are vital to the board's mission, and we welcome community feedback on our work. If you have comments to the board, written testimony must be submitted by 4:30 the day of the scheduled meeting. If you'd like to speak at our meeting, please email our staff at waddle@tigard-or.gov. That's EDUAR@tigard-or.gov. Additional detail and instruction are available at www.tigard.or.gov/PSAB. So I'm going to pass it over to Chief to give us an update. Chief?
Thank you, John. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm going to keep my video off just to have a better connection. The only updates that I have for you is we really took the comments that you gave us regarding encouraging revisiting our community academy, formerly known as the Citizen Academy. And so Stephanie and Kelsey have done a great job of designing what that program will look like. We were hoping to do a launch in October, but due to the COVID Delta variants, we're going to punt it until probably January. So look for more, because we hope that you either will sponsor somebody or you'll have a section in there that talks about what the Public Safety Advisory Board does. And that's my update for tonight.
Okay. With that, we're going to just move on. And our next agenda item is qualified immunity with Dave Lewis. So I want to welcome Dave Lewis to the PSRB. You have, I'm not sure the chief want to introduce the speaker.
Tammy, has Dave joined us yet?
It doesn't look like he's joined us.
Do that.
Okay, so he is, because he's on the agenda for later tonight, I can try to get in touch with him, but he's not supposed to be here for later. So maybe we could start the other item on the agenda and I can try to find Dave.
Sure, thank you, Chevy. How about Sergeant Phillips and Sergeant Rivera? Are they on? Oh,
They are.
Justin has his hand up. Let's ask Justin.
Yes, thank you, John. I was just thinking, because we are moving along quite fast with today's agenda, if we could actually revisit that one public comment that did come in. And I was just thinking, because it does pertain to an item on the agenda that we'll be discussing today, if that could actually be read out loud, if that is okay, and if the rest of the board would oblige to that.
Sounds good. Eduardo, can you pull up the written comment and read that to us?
Okay, let me pull it up real quick.
Thank you.
Actually, I have it in front of me. Would you like me to read it?
Okay, thanks, Patty.
All righty.
Thank you.
Qualified immunity is one of the biggest legal barriers when it comes to holistic police reform, which goes hand in hand with racial justice. Qualified immunity is essentially a legal loophole designed to create an atmosphere of zero accountability when it comes to policing. The lack of consequences is a huge barrier when it comes to weeding out, in quotes, the bad apples, which essentially weakens the police force as a whole. It's disheartening to see some of the most powerful members of our community being a help to such a loose set of rules. Normally, when you sue a civilian, you have to prove that person violated your rights. However, when you try to sue law enforcement, you have to prove that they violated a right that was clearly established. However, that right isn't considered clearly established unless someone successfully sues the person against those specific clauses. As Hassan Minhaj puts it as an analogy, it's like applying for a first job, but them asking for previous job experience. It's this endless cycle that is impossible to break. The Corbett family's son in 2016 was accidentally shot in his own yard, which was a misfire from the initial target that was a dog, which the Corbett family tried suing the cop. But the federal court ruled that there was no violation of clearly established rights of a cop who misfired and shot a kid instead. Qualified immunity helps people get away with virtually anything as long as they haven't been sued over that precedent before. Abolishing qualified immunity ensures a safer environment as well as a more accountable police force. That's it.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Patty. Does anyone want to make a statement or comment? Valerie.
I think, John, by reading this ahead of time, it's going to help you ask questions of Dave Lewis when he gets here, because I do know the Supreme Court has said they are not going to take this on. In fact, they've dropped the issue. So I think it'll be important to understand what qualified immunity does or does not do. And it's much broader than law enforcement. So perfect timing on this. And hopefully Dave can answer a lot of questions you may have.
Thank you, Chief. I see, Valerie, you have your hand up?
Yeah, first, as a point to the chief's comment, the denial of certiorari is not necessarily a statement that the Supreme Court is not going to take this issue up. It's a statement that the Supreme Court has declined to address it in the circumstances that it arrived before them. So, and then the other thing that I did want to mention about the comment that Patty read is that it was submitted by our newest youth counselor, Youth Counselor Nag. And so I think it's worth noting that this is an issue that at least one of our city council members has thought was important enough to submit a comment on in her role as a public citizen, or private citizen. So I look forward to the discussion on this as we continue it, because I think this may be one of the most consequential discussions that we have in our discussions of these issues.
Sean, you had a comment?
Yes, thank you. So just procedurally, are we going to start reading all of our public comments? Because we've had a mixture of comments. So are we going to read them all? I'm just curious.
Typically we don't, but I think because it was pertinent to the topic, if it's really relevant.
Okay, sure.
And Justin Lowe.
Yes, I have two comments. The first was just in response to Sean's question. I think that we have been operating under not reading them as they've been submitted. I just made the request specifically because it seemed pertinent to today's topic. And it was an item that we will be discussing on the agenda, as I'd mentioned earlier. As for commenting about Youth Counselor Nag's submission, I just also wanted to acknowledge and extend appreciation for her submission of that comment and bringing it to the attention of our board of her feelings, as well as folks that she is probably talking to and representing as a youth counselor. So I greatly appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and presentation we'll have later.
Great, thank you. Shelby, have you had any luck getting a hold of Dave, or should we go on to the sergeant?
Yeah, I have not. So I would allow the sergeants to go ahead with their presentation.
Hey,
Great,
Tammy,
thank you. Mm-hmm.
If the chief has a moment, it's been a while since we heard anything about the body cam policy. And I was just wondering if she would mind giving us an update on where things stand in the revisions to that.
Not at all. Be happy to. So I have the final or the draft with all the recommended changes or reviews. And the next step is for me to read it all, finalize it, and then present it to the union for review. So we are very close.
Thank you, Chief.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the defensive tactic. And I want to welcome Sergeant Phillip and Sergeant Rivera to present on that topic.
Hi, I'm Sergeant Phillips,
Sergeant Rivera.
and I believe Kim had our PowerPoint, but I will try to share it with you guys. So give me a second. We're not the most technologically savvy gentlemen there are.
So do you see the button that says share screen?
It worked.
I think you've done it.
Look at that.
Impressive.
We try. All right, so we'll just do a few slides. We'll kind of talk about some of the stuff as we go along. If you have questions, we'll break every few slides and answer those as best we can. And instead of waiting towards the end, because we're going to kind of cover quite a bit of stuff, that varying topics. So with that, defensive tactics, Sergeant Rivera, Sergeant Phillips, we've both been employed here at Tigard for about 14 years almost. So what are defensive tactics? Defensive tactics are skills used to defend from an attack and subdue individuals who are committing a criminal offense or are a threat to themselves or a threat to others. So that's pretty broad. It covers a lot of things. And when we see skills and when we talk about defensive tactics, people tend to immediately think that, oh, you're fighting. It's not just that. There's a whole gambit that we'll get into about the other things. It's not just punching or kicking or wrestling or things like that. We're going to cover that. But in the broad one sentence statement, that is what defensive tactics is there.
Goals of the defensive tactics teams. Again, Sergeant Phillips and Sergeant Rivera, we're kind of co-partners in the leadership of the training of defensive tactics. So the goal of the defensive tactic team is to give update and current training to the members of the Tigard Police Department. Defensive tactics is a safety skill. We go through pre-academy and post-academy training, annual training, and we also do a lot of physical or trainings during our briefings and stuff like that. So to touch base on that, we like to go over report writing. We like to go over what we could have done better, how we could have had better verbal communication and policy and so on. And we like to do that during briefing or even defensive tactics annual training. Now we're doing those things on top of doing physical training. So it's a lot to do in the 2-hour block that we get.
Yeah, and then you see on there, go home safe, everyone. That's kind of the motto that we try to teach. And that's not just for us, that's for everyone involved, whether it's a suspect, a citizen, a person in crisis, anything like that. We want everyone to go home safe. Now, that doesn't always happen, as we all know, but that is our ultimate goal. So threat assessment. So it's kind of the first thing that we have to do when dealing with the situation. And there's certain indicators and there's certain, metrics that must be met when we do a threat assessment. So the first one is the threat must have the intent. So what that means is the threat must demonstrate his or her intent to inflict physical injury or resist being controlled through body language or verbalization. So what we see a lot of is a person says, expletive, you're not taking me to jail. I'm going to kick your whatever. You can't take me, things like that. So we get a lot of verbalization, and that could just be when we're talking to somebody for, a minor violation, or, maybe it's not a minor thing, it's something big. And then body language is a big one too. People, they'll do all kinds of what we call indicators, and things like indicators, maybe a bladed stance or like a fighting stance where they're on the balls of their feet, their knees are bent. They have balled up fists. They're really angry. All those type of things are like those body language that we look for. So that indicates there's an intent to cause harm or resist. Means the threat must have the means. The threat must have the physical capabilities to carry out the aggression or resistance. So what does that mean? If they don't have a knife and they say they're going to stab you, and we know they don't have a knife because maybe they're naked in the street, we know they're not going to stab us, right? Because they don't have the knife. We dealt with people in a wheelchair that say they're going to run away, or with a broken leg. They don't have the means to run away. They don't have the physical capabilities to do that. And then opportunity, a threat must have the opportunity, have access to the officer or object to carry out the perceived aggression. So a big one for that is distance and space. So if a suspect is, say, behind a fence, it would take them a lot of effort to try to attack us or to try to fight because there's a fence in the way. Same as being like in a vehicle. They might not have the opportunity. But again, there's no clear-cut thing because every situation is different. Any questions so far? No, okay.
So we're talking about defensive tactics basics here. We try to use, on all accounts, and we train the minimum amount of force necessary to accomplish the goal. All right. None of us want to fight anybody. We're too old and we don't have enough training for that kind of stuff. So, but the minimum amount of force will stop injury to both sides, officer, witnesses, or anybody that's involved, loss prevention officer, or even the suspect. In almost all cases, Tigard police use less force than is legally justified. There's times where you can do strikes when somebody's pinned down underneath them and we're not able to take them into custody. And we could use pressure points instead. We could give verbal commands that you might be tased, and arms come out. So this runs the gambit. There's so many scenarios that could happen here. Goal of applying force is not a punishment or punitive. Force is used to gain compliance, usually to get a person detained and in handcuffs. Just like a bent wrist lock or something like that. If we use a bent wrist lock on somebody because we can't control them because they could be stronger than us, or it's just harder to control somebody, to handcuff them. Handcuffing is where I want somebody because hands are the ones that usually hurt you. If I'm using a bent wrist lock and they say, okay, and they stop resisting, you can let go of the bent wrist lock. Again, it just goes with movement, fluid movement. It's not a punishment.
So physical control. So there's basically two categories of physical control, minor and serious. So minor is takedowns, and that can be everything from, telling somebody that, we maybe are holding onto their arm and we say, hey, go to the ground. We need you to go to the ground, and we guide them to the ground, all the way to like a dynamic takedown, which could be literally pulling or pushing somebody to the ground. Those are all considered generally minor control. Digital control is finger control, and that comes into play mostly during handcuffing. So we grip the fingers and then, with one hand, holding the fingers together of both hands of the suspect, and then we apply handcuffs. But sometimes if somebody tries to pull away, we have control of those and we can, pull on those fingers, sometimes bend them back to gain compliance in order to apply those handcuffs. Pressure points are actually a really effective tool. I'm sure you're all familiar, and or maybe if you had older brothers or sisters, they used to do pressure points on you, and it hurts, and it doesn't take much for it to hurt and make you uncomfortable, and then do what we need you to do, which is most likely put your hands behind your back.
Not all of these things work with everybody also, and everybody's different depending on if there's anything else on board also. With the digital control, the reason we train that seems like a silly thing to control somebody's hands, but the number one time that I've seen in my career and have studied with force science and all that is people are usually going to try to run away or fight to get away during the handcuffing moment. And that's why we try to train that as much. That's when it usually happens. Sorry.
OC spray, so it's like a pepper spray. I think you guys discussed that in one of the other ones, maybe not, but OC spray is it's not just a pain compliance type thing. It burns, it gets in your nasal cavity, it gets in your eyes, it's disorienting. Your body's natural reaction is to close your eyes. If you can't see, you're going to have a very hard time punching me or running away or, doing whatever activity we need you to stop. And then we have uncooperative handcuffing. And we see this a lot where, hey, turn around, put your hands behind your back. No, I'm not going to do that. And so, 2 or 3 officers will go on and do what we call hands-on and basically pull their arms behind their back, and kind of just use physical overpowering to place them into handcuffs. Serious physical control, that's where you have focus blows or strikes. There's a whole variety of those: punching, slapping, closed fist versus palm heel, knee strikes, kicks, things like that. Those are under serious physical control. Once we're in this side, things have, I don't want to use the term gotten out of hand, but this is definitely more serious. So now we're in a fight. We're in, something is happening that we need to stop. Taser. Taser is a great tool. I can tell you that it's not as effective as often as people want to believe. Some people it has no effect on. Some people it completely incapacitates them. So it is a great tool, though, that we try to use when we can, if we need to. And then we have what are called impact weapons. Those are a baton, whether it's an expandable baton or a long straight stick used for striking. There's a beanbag round we currently carry. It's just your traditional 12 gauge shotgun with a less load and a beanbag in it. The nice thing about that is the distance you can get. And then also 40 millimeters. We currently do not carry those. However, we have some and we're awaiting training for those. That's just another less lethal tool, to use at a distance. There's a variety of rounds those shoot. We currently only will be issued, basically it's a foam round or a sponge round. It's not like a Nerf gun. It does hit with some power, but it is a stopping mechanism to use on somebody if need be. And then on the bottom, you'll see it says not a force continuum. We do not have a force continuum. We haven't for a long time because every situation is different. And we may not be able to start at the lowest level of force. Given the situation or the circumstances, we might have to jump to a very high level of force based on what the individual is doing. Force continuum generally has it has steps where you tell them to stop and then, order them to stop. And then maybe you try to go hands-on and then maybe you spray them and then maybe you use a taser. Well, if somebody is actively trying to kill somebody else and I show up, I'm going to do my best to yell stop, but I'm going to do everything to get them to prevent them from trying to kill somebody else.
I think also on the continuum where it comes into play on officer, I would just call it size and strength difference, where if I personally would show up to a call, I maybe not be able to control something a different way just from pure strength and size from the suspect compared to another officer that we have. And we could go into a bunch of different, how comfortable you feel with these tactics. Not everybody's not everybody's good at fighting. Not everybody's good at blocking, running, all that stuff. So the continuum changes for every different officer also, where I think it wouldn't always work for everybody if we're both showing up at the same time. Any questions?
Any questions, anyone so far?
I missed this question a little earlier. Oh, sorry. I didn't raise my hand.
Go ahead, Patty.
Fine, go ahead.
Go ahead, Patty.
Can you?
Then we'll take Jeff.
Thank you, sorry. Can you clarify under the annual training, the difference between physical and classroom?
Sure. We're actually going to get into that a little bit, but physical would be, we run through, we do like a warm up, which, would just be like your basic stretches and, run around, jog for a little bit. And then it does vary. Sometimes we'll do practice striking, whether we have gloves on against another officer or a punching bag, or we have these, we call them they're a bob, but they're like a heavy plastic that's built like the shape of a person. So striking, kicking those, we work on form, technique, things like that. We want officers to not only learn skills, but be comfortable in their skills. Just like anything, these skills are perishable, and people can lose them. So we want them to practice so they know what to do. And we try to induce stress as well, because it's a very, getting in a fight or getting attacked is very stressful, and it shakes your brain and you can't focus on a lot of things. So we want to try to indoctrinate our officers into that sometimes, so they can have at least a little bit of a taste of it from a classroom safe zone versus out on the street, where it's all of the sudden and violent and troublesome.
Yeah, to piggyback on that physical part too, is we got to have mats. We got to try to keep each other safe, but we also got to try to stress the mind and the heart rate a little bit. So if we could do scenario type stuff, the first thing that usually goes when you get scared or you're fatigued is your communication skills. So what we're trying to implement here is not only can you block, ground fight, maybe strike, but you can still be giving communication while this goes on. Your brain can only do so much. You need to train that so you could do the physical part along with the communication part. And that's what we strive to do.
Does that answer your question?
And then Jeff Mott had a question.
Hi, thanks for taking us through this. I have a couple questions so far. On the prior slide, you talked about uncooperative handcuffing and you referenced multiple officers. Do you train to communicate with the other officers while trying to handcuff?
Absolutely.
The reason I bring it up is so many of the videos around police brutality are someone trying to get handcuffed where they're just held to the ground and they can't move, but they're being screamed at, stop resisting. So I'm just curious how you guys work through that.
So we do train, well, to start off, we train to not handcuff a person by yourself. That's not always the case. Maybe all the officers are tied up and, somebody has to be in handcuffs, but we do train, even our command staff, our commanders will come out and cover an officer, because 2-on-1 is always better than 1-on-1. And we do train to communicate a lot as like, hey, if Sergeant Rivera needs to take somebody in custody and he calls me up and says, come cover me, come be my cover officer or my backup officer. I show up, he will tell me, hey, this person needs to go to jail, or I have probable cause for this. Sometimes we'll do it over the radio. We don't like the suspect to hear that, because when somebody knows they're going to jail, a lot of times that's when they're going to flee or fight. But we do communicate that, and we do communicate what's going on, and we try to come up with a plan as well. Like, okay, maybe we need 3 officers here to cover, the suspect all the way around.
Yeah, to piggyback on that question also, it seems like a very easy thing to pull people's arms out from under them, even with 2 or 3 officers. And sometimes we're fighting each other more than we should. That's where the communication comes into play also. But it is very, very hard to pull somebody's arms out from really close to their body. That's where all your power is. All right. So sometimes we're just overpowered. I'm going to be honest. And it just takes a long time. And it looks like it's just a mess that's going on. So.
Okay.
We try to have a plan.
Okay, thanks. And my second question, I know there is no force continuum for the worst scenarios when you can't have something in place. Is in practice though, knowing the vast majority of your encounters with the public aren't that type, Is there something like a force continuum that you guys kind of go through, even without having that specific policy in place?
I would say yes. I mean, just based off the way we train, because we definitely do ask for compliance, right? It doesn't hurt to ask. So that's kind of, and then we tell and we give a lawful order. You know, we can say, hey, you're under arrest. I need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. That works a lot of the time. It really does. But it doesn't work every time. And then, you know, then we might have to use our voice and a, you know, more stern tone. You are under arrest and I need you to put your hands behind your back right now. I'm giving you a lawful order to do so. So we do train that way, to ask somebody, to tell them, and then sometimes we have to make them. You know, it's not our goal to immediately go hands-on and grab somebody if we don't have to. I don't want to do it. He doesn't want to do it. None of our officers want to do it. And we train accordingly for that. It's just easier for everybody. It reduces risk of injury to everybody. And it reduces, you know, liability as well. So there is a training component to that, to what we do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, I think sometimes we're going into, we don't have all the information too. When you say that every contact, and I agree with you. Thank God that not every contact is the extreme, but there's a lot of clothing, there's a lot of knives, a lot of weapons. We don't know who we're contacting. We don't have we just might have a general description. Everything comes into play, daytime, nighttime, dark alley or not, raining in Oregon. What we would like to see, if we could get somebody detained, that way we could do the pat down. Everybody's safer that way. But the verbal skills is what I'm saying, that sometimes when it gets out of hand quickly, the verbal skills are what suffers, which is what we train is to get. There's nothing like getting fear in your body. You could run a mile. It's not the same as fear. Fear is what shuts down the body and wants to keep you safe. And that's what we try to train a little bit more on the physical aspect of it.
Justin has a question.
Thank you, Sergeant Phillips and Sergeant Rivera, for your presentation thus far. These aren't necessarily, I have two comments, not necessarily questions, but they do spur a conversation that I think is important for this group. And the first pertains to something that we had already brought up with Sergeant Erickson and Commander McDonald before, but I just want to mention it again because it pertains to this current presentation. And that was back on the slide regarding threat assessment. I know at least one of our community PSAB board members has brought up a story in the past that's related to this, and it's around the topic of threat assessment with the intent to do or create harm. And the issue that we raised with Commander McDonald and Sergeant Erickson before is that we would have hoped that there's some form of racial or cultural competency training within the police department, because different communities and folks communicate and interact in different ways, especially when it comes to body language. I myself love to talk with my hands, for example, and I know that there are folks who are people of color who also do talk with their hands a lot and are expressive and engaging in their communication styles. And so I know that Sergeant Erickson and Commander McDonald had mentioned that this is something that was novel and important to them to look into. I just wanted to raise that since you had presented about threat assessment. And then the second thing that I wanted to make comment on is going back to our conversation about not having a force continuum. I understand why that is not present within the police department and why there are circumstances where you would either need to escalate or de-escalate based off of rapid assessment of the situation. However, one of the things that concerns me in one of the comments that one of you had made regarding different police officers having different comfort levels in engaging in fighting or in use of force due to either their skill or lack of, or due to their frame or body size or age or whatnot, any other factors that could either encourage someone to feel more competent in engaging in physical force or someone who might not. My worry is that for someone who might be of smaller frame or lower skill set in terms of physical detaining, that individual might be maybe more inclined to use something of higher force because they're not willing to engage with someone directly in close engagement or in physical detainment. And so that's the comment that I wanted to make in regards to the use of force and force continuum.
Regarding your second comment, we're going to talk more on that coming up about that. There's some more info on that, but just real quick, there is, just like everybody in the community, all the police officers are different too, right? We have different sizes, skills, and all that. And so they might have a different, their skill set is only so good that day, or they're tired, or, we have an officer and she's wonderful. And I don't think she even weighs 100 pounds and she's a great officer, but she knows her limitations. So physically, and I don't mean that in a, she can't do the job or she can't do this or whatever, but we all have to be aware of that. I have a bad lower back. So I know that there are certain things I can't do and I don't want to do physically because I don't want to injure that. So we will talk more about that though. Mm-hmm. And then regards to your first comment, we do some training about that. Not only does the Academy teach some of that, we incorporate that in our training scenarios. And we don't necessarily come out and say, hey, I'm a person of this ethnic background or whatever, but, we do have, role players that will, talk with their hands or act all agitated, which is okay. That's not criminal. And we try to teach and ingrain like, hey, maybe that's just this person's behavior. And again, that's not a crime. Or the other one we use a lot is certain, groups of people like to talk really close to other people. That's changed a little bit with COVID. And that's nice that we can keep distance with that. But, some people just feel more comfortable because they've grown up that way. Their background is that way. They will talk very close. And so we incorporate a lot of those different things in our actual training scenarios to give officers, some exposure and experience to that. So, and it goes along with the totality of the circumstances. Are we just talking to this citizen because they needed help and they had a flat tire? Or does this person match the description of somebody else that just committed a robbery? So all those things come into play with that.
Justin had another comment.
I can wait until further into the presentation because I know that the sergeant had mentioned that they're going to address more of my second comment later. So thank you.
And Jimmy had a comment or question?
It's primarily a question. As it relates to training on the issue of cultural communication styles, do you use outside consultants, or is this find a training officer in the department? If you don't bring in outside consultants, are you open to that occurring? And I say that because, my view of the department right now is that obviously it is working on its gender and ethnic diversity, but we have a fairly broad spectrum of diversity in the community. And as such, learning how different groups communicate amongst themselves, how they communicate in situations where they may be angry, would, I think, be a value to the department.
To answer part of that, we do occasionally train with other agencies. I wouldn't necessarily say they're a consultant, but we might do training with like an agency that's close by, like Tualatin or Sherwood, things like that. And then our officers do go, they can apply to go to trainings that are maybe even outside the state, with different agencies where Seattle police will put on a training that's open to any officer in the Northwest. And so they do get some of that. But again, I wouldn't call that a consultant. I would be fine with it and open to it, but I feel like the chief could maybe address that a little bit more.
Chief?
Oh, maybe she's having connection problems. So
Yeah, she is having connection problems. So maybe we can
Until-
get back to her.
No, sorry, you guys. I had my screen lowered so that I could look at the PowerPoint as well. So it just took me a minute to get where I found the unmute button. Yeah, I think Jimmy, I know exactly what you're talking about, and it is. There has been some online training to talk about different cultures, how they communicate, and to look for those indicators. So that you get more in doctrine. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and that's definitely something I can talk to these guys offline about.
Great, because again, I look at this. I'm not against the Tualatin Police Department or the Sherwood Police Department, or Newburgh or Dundee or Banks, if you catch my drift. They're not probably the most diverse organizations relative to having a broader understanding of what may happen in terms of the communication styles that may be evident out in the community. So I know that there are a number of consultants in the Portland metropolitan area. I know there are consultants in the city of Tigard. I know there are staff in Tigard Tualatin School District that show a real expertise on working cross-culturally. And so this might be an opportunity for the department to, outreach to some of those organizations and see if there is a way in which there can be some partnership.
Are there any more questions? I think you guys can move forward. There's no more questions on this topic.
All right, so next, handcuffing. This force application usually occurs prior to handcuffing, is what we've run into most of the time. Handcuffing is going to go on. It's the last ditch effort. I'm talking about people that know they're going to go to jail or have committed a crime and all that. Most injury complaints come from handcuffing, liability lawsuits. They're just not comfortable at all. Officers required to check for proper fit, tightness, and double lock it. Anytime you put the handcuffs on, double lock it, there's documentation that needs to be done, report written. So what we ask for is a handcuff on. I could get about a little bit of my pinky in between the handcuff and the person's arm and double lock it. So when they sit back on it or anything happens, it doesn't just keep ratcheting down on them and tightening up. They are not comfortable. They're made out of steel. They're not comfortable. And if somebody has shoulder injury, shoulder problems, big in the shoulders, we accommodate people with 2 sets of handcuffs behind their back. That way to help out with the shoulder, any kind of shoulder injury or anything they might have had in the past.
All right. It is incumbent on the officer to overcome the threat's resistance as quickly as possible to minimize the possibility of injury or degree of injury to the threat and the officer. So in short, what that means is, or above this very tired cop's head, more time equals more risk. There's thousands of studies that show that. So the more time you spend in a struggle, in a fight, the greater the risk is to everybody involved. One of the biggest things because of that is fatigue. If you've ever trained or been in a fight or even just like a sprint run as fast as you can, it does not take long to get completely exhausted. Throw fear into that and the unknown of somebody accessing weapons. and just the danger goes on. So we like if we have to use force, we want it to be over quick. And that's not just for us, that's for the suspect as well. We don't know if they're going to access weapons. We don't know if they're going to take off or there's flight or they run. And then there's a bunch of outside influences too. Those could be bystanders. We have seen, people not involved suddenly get involved into an altercation, either helping us or hindering us. Another big influence around here is traffic. So, an officer pulls a car over and the driver has a warrant and is getting arrested, and now they're fighting on the side of the road at 217. Well, if you've been on 217, which I bet you all have, I don't want to be on the fog line wrestling, rolling around with traffic screaming by me even during rush hour, it's 30 miles an hour. So we really try to teach, get it over quick, make the arrest, do what you have to do to avoid that risk of injury to everyone involved.
Yeah, I think the fatigue part is big, because it's one thing to teach everybody in a sterile environment sometimes, but having 35 pounds of extra gear on you, having to control your own weapons from going out, those are other things that you're thinking about in something like this. Even myself, if I've trained before, it's totally different when I'm in a gym than when I'm out in the open. I get tired a lot quicker than I would any other time. So the officer versus threat factors. We have, as you could read them here, officer versus threat factors, officer versus threats age. Unfortunately, I don't like saying this, but we're getting older. The age comes into effect. For me, especially, late night, bars coming, they're releasing patrons and all that. I know I'm getting quite a bit older. So weapons, access to weapons, officer versus threat size and strength. All that is part of showing up and taking a look and trying to access as much information into your brain as you can right when you're showing up. Threat skill level. Sometimes you run into people that have certain gym membership sweatshirts on or big cauliflower ears and stuff like that. Those are just little indicators to me, like, hey, these people have better skill set than I do on this kind of stuff. Threats, mental state, drugs. We've been seeing that a lot lately. Multiple threats, just more than one person that you have to communicate with. The officer's ability, that comes into play a lot. And then all the other unknowns.
Any questions so far? Moving on. Considerations for the justification of force. So these are the things that we try to teach officers to think about prior to using force. So is the action worth the risk of injury to yourself or the threat? So you have to ask yourself that. And a lot of that comes with, what is the crime? So if somebody goes to the plaid pantry and steals a beer and goes around back and is drinking it, and we contact them for a $1.99 theft, and they're giving us all those indicators that we talked about earlier that they're going to fight. They told us they're going to fight. They act like they're going to fight. Is it really worth it over, that can of beer? Probably not. It really isn't. Is this the reasonable amount of force necessary to control the threat? So that goes into, what force am I using? And is it reasonable to use that? So if you tell somebody they're under arrest and they go, oh man, I don't want to go to jail, does that mean we immediately tase them because they said that? No, it doesn't. So all these thoughts are running through officers' minds constantly because things are rapidly evolving, right? So we use the reasonable amount of force to control them. So we might be like, yeah, you are going to jail. Now I need you to turn around. And we might, go hands-on, which is just taking hold of their arm, telling them, yep. And then they, hopefully they comply. Does the threat have the opportunity to comply with lawful commands? So this is a big one in that most cases, we always try to give them an opportunity. Like I said before, we ask, right? So we ask them, hey, I need you to put your hands behind your back. Will you please put your hands behind your back? But we have to give them a chance to comply. What's the point of asking if we don't? Now, how long do we give them to comply? Well, it certainly depends, because there's no straight answer. Depends on what they're doing, right? So if we say, hey, giving you a lawful order to put your hands behind your back because you're under arrest, and then they take off running, well, they're clearly not going to comply. But if they take a few seconds and go, oh, I don't want to go to jail. Well, okay. So we've given them an opportunity, and hopefully they comply. And then, is the current course of action accomplishing the desired result? And so what that means is we have a lot of tools, right? We have verbal skills, we have de-escalation skills, we have, going hands-on, we have OC spray, we have tasers, but they don't all work. So sitting there and negotiating with somebody that we know has to go to jail, they've committed a violent felony, and we're discussing it with them, and we're talking it to them, and they're giving us, for a protracted amount of time, they're telling us no, that isn't working. So now we have to do something different. It's the same as if we have a suspect laying on their stomach with their arms tucked up under them, like Sergeant Rivera said, that's hard to get somebody's out. If we just sit there and pull on their arms and it's not working, we have to do something different, because we don't know what's going to happen. And we're not going to just sit there and play tug of war with their arms, trying to get them out if it's not working, because we don't know if they're accessing a gun or a knife and things like that. So all these thoughts are constantly in the minds of officers, like, what am I doing? They're, as the scenario is changing second by second, they're constantly running all these thoughts through their head.
I like a lot of it is, is the action worth the risk? Well, severity of the crime is going to be a big thing for us, and how we train even in briefings. What is the severity of the crime? Now we're just implementing what kind of crimes are we even willing to go and touch somebody for, right? Or go hands-on with them. A known subject, right? A lot of our calls, once we get there, like, okay, we kind of know who this person is. Sometimes somebody who's on, these are just generic, this isn't like all the time, but it's like, if somebody's really high on drugs or something like that I know a lot of my tools aren't going to work, I'll get them later, right? It's a known person. So we're trying to come up with stuff at briefing and good topics where we could be like, okay, we don't always have to get them right at that moment. But then when there's a felony, a really big felony crime against a human or something like that, there's times where we got to act. So there's good communication that we have at briefing in regards to stuff like this. What we teach in DTs, I know we've gone a little bit over this, but legal updates, we had to keep up with the legal updates, the case law, and our policy. And I would also include on that with our policy is report writing. As Sergeant Phillips has said numerous times, just saying that somebody was agitated is not going to work in a report, and why you grabbed them and threw them down on the ground. Give me the physical descriptors. They were yelling, they were spitting mad, they clenched up their fists, they took one step towards me, their shoulders rolled up like they were going to throw a punch, stuff like that. Just saying they're agitated doesn't give me anything there to know why you were in fear. Defense and offense. Defense, a lot of my defense that we teach now is time and separation. Separate from the person and call for other units, because a one-on-one game is not what I want to have. And then defense also is blocking, how to block a punch or a strike. Offense, we went over that. Any kind of striking, elbows, knees, ground fighting, how to reverse from the bottom position from somebody mounting you. How do you do all that stuff? So there's a lot. Again, we're doing this in a 2-hour block, but we got to go through a lot of stuff here. Suspect control. How do you just escort somebody out of the mall when there's a lot of people around and you've handcuffed them? Handcuffing and searching. Escort holds, strikes, body positioning. Sometimes you got handcuffs on somebody, you want to put them in a disadvantaged position. So spread their feet and have them bend at the waist. That way they can't just take off running on you, and now we got another fight. Environmental barriers, traffic, sidewalks, you name it. Weapon retention, we always have weapons on us, so we got to make sure we can retain those, even if we're on a foot chase or anything like that. Identifying risks, again, right when you show up, you got to start scanning and seeing where the risks are. 2-on-1 control, we've talked about. I'd rather have 2 officers, 3 officers on 1 person if we know we have to take somebody into custody. And the big thing for me is verbal communication. It does look like we're not communicating, and a lot of the videos show stop resisting. But again, we don't train enough. 2 hours once or twice a year is not what it would take for me to be proficient at, let's just say, defensive tactics, trying to stay alive and communicating with everybody else around me what I need done, because that part of the brain shuts down. My motor skills are, my brain is working on my motor skills alone. So anything else?
Any questions so far? Okay.
Oh, we have a question from Valerie.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I must have missed this earlier, but you were just saying that the training on defensive tactics for the police officers is 2 hours a year or 2 hours twice a year, or how much training does it end up being?
Was it 2 hour, 4 hour blocks? I think we try to do 4-hour blocks twice a year, but with COVID and everything,
Oh, yeah.
4-hour blocks twice a year, and then briefing trainings. The briefing trainings we could get through with a lot of the report writing, legal and stuff. And then the 4-hour blocks, we could do a lot of the physical stuff.
Sure.
Physical stuff is, a lot of it is prior to working out. We've got to make sure we're stretched out and warmed up.
Right. And so the whole department will do this at the same time, or you'll do it in groups, or how does that work?
We do it in groups. Obviously, we can't all do it at once because we'll be out there. So we kind of rotate. So generally what we would do is we would have a week-long period, and we would try to have like a morning class and an afternoon classes, 4 or 5 days of that week, and try to rotate everybody through while other people are, well, sorry, that's a body camera. While other people are, covering the road. So logistically, I'm not going to lie to you, it is very difficult. If we have it 4 days and that's somebody's work day, that's a challenge to get it covered. If it's somebody's days off, vacation, we generally then will try to have a makeup day within a month to make up for people that have missed it. And then this training is what we teach, to current officers. So at the academy, there is also an extensive defensive tactics program as well that they do on not every day, but they do it pretty regularly while they're there. And then prior to the academy, we give them kind of like an 8-hour, kind of like a DT introduction. It is a lot of policy. It is a lot of case law. It is a lot of Tigard reporting because, the state academy teaches state standards. We try to hold ourselves to a higher standard for that. But you also don't want to send a new recruit to the academy with no basis of knowledge. We feel like that kind of sets them up for failure. They go to the academy and they've never put handcuffs on and don't know how they work. We'd be doing them a disservice. So.
Sure. And within those classes, I'm just concerned because so much of this, if you're scared, you're essentially relying on training and muscle memory, right? And, do people have the opportunity in these trainings to develop that? It seems like if everybody's going through over a fairly compressed period of time, those classes may be even a little bit big for people to develop those skills.
Well, yeah, I'd agree. We try to give them a taste of it. It's not enough time, but so I'll be honest, it's not enough time that we would necessarily like to see. We do try to give them a taste of that fear and that experience that and get the physical stuff and punch a static target and things like that. But
even within DTs, we have a great force on force program where we actually get in a full red man suit, they call it, but us instructors try to put people in scenarios where yes, it gets your heart rate up, and it does. 14 years in, and I go on the other side, it still gets your heart rate up, and that's that's the kind of training, repetitive training that we need. And we do that once a year, where that kind of repetitive training, it does help you with the verbal communication, I think, on it. And what I mean by verbal communication, sometimes the best thing is to back away and wait for another person.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate the clarification.
Of course. So some things to consider. The application of force is generally not pretty and does not, quote, look good to the untrained eye. There are often factors, perceived or real, that others might not be aware of or video doesn't show. Officers have split second to make a decision that very well could be life or death. So some of those things are, well, let's talk about like the video one, right? So we've all seen tons of horrible police videos of whether it's shootings or it's fights or anything like that. And the video doesn't always show everything or give the whole story. So when you see a video of a person that looks like they're just attacking somebody, or sorry, a police officer is just attacking a citizen or beating them up, well, a lot of times when you find those, they don't give the story. Well, maybe this is a known suspect. Maybe this person just committed a violent felony. Maybe this person just ran from the police and, you know, assaulted another officer who is on their way to the hospital now. So getting that whole story, it isn't always there. Another part of it, when it doesn't look pretty, when we talked about, you know, the time, spending more time in a struggle with somebody, it increases the risk. So we try to end that quick. So we're not going to sit there and, you know, try to pull somebody's arms out from under them. If we can't do it and we figure out we can't do it and we're running in our mind, hey, this isn't working, I need to do something different, we might, you know, strike them with a knee. That pain compliance, that shock, maybe lets them loosen up the tension in their arms, and then we can pull them up. But again, that doesn't look bad because it looks like the person is just laying there. I'm not saying there's not, you know, some of those videos are bad, 100%. I don't think you'll find an officer in the Tigard Police Department that doesn't say there's plenty of bad videos. But as far as what we train and what we try to do, you know, you got to look at the whole thing and the entire totality of the circumstances and get the whole story. And a lot of times that doesn't come across in the media, and that doesn't come across in the little 30-second clip, right? Generally, any involvement, you know, that an officer has here that involves force, there is generally a big lead up to that, from the 911 call or the dispatch call to the officer driving there, to the updates that they receive along the way, to the initial suspect contact or victim contact. But nobody, you know, the 10 o'clock news isn't going to show that whole 10 minutes, right? They're going to be like, oh, look at it, here's another officer beating somebody up. Well, it may be justified, or it may have been necessary. Sergeant Erickson talked about lawful but awful. So this kind of plays into that, right? It's lawful, but it sure looks bad. And just because it's lawful doesn't make it right. I understand that. But, you know, we unfortunately in this line of work, we do have to use force sometimes. And it's necessary to protect ourselves, to protect the public, and even sometimes to protect the citizen from themselves, or, you know, from them harming somebody else. You got anything? Question, I see.
Jimmy has a question.
Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. I totally get the discussions around what the media portrays and what people are posting on YouTube or Facebook or whatever social media platform. And I'm not sure that there's a way necessarily to get around that. But what I do expect from our police department, hopefully from most police departments, is that there is a value about transparency. That when given the opportunity to explain the lawful but awful situation that occurs, that the department mirrors a value where transparency is a priority. Because it's that point where the local community, I won't say the citizenry, I'm calling it the community at large, will try to have a better understanding of what it is that police officers are trying to accomplish when we witness lawful but awful behavior. And so, you know, and I'm saying this really for the viewing public tonight, because we know that there is a certain part of the community that wants to blame the lawful but awful video on the media, or as you said, on Channel 6 or Channel 8. But the reality is that I think we can at least deflect some of that criticism by ensuring that we focus on transparency as a value and as a habit inside of the department. So no question, just a statement.
Jimmy, and Liz Newman has a question, or Newton, sorry, has a question.
Yeah, thanks. I was gonna say something similar to what Jimmy just said. And I think we're trying to do a good job regarding transparency in the department. I also think one of the benefits of the Public Safety Advisory Board is bringing a lot of the ways that the department does its work, trying to align with the community values. And I made some notes about, I appreciated the comments about getting some cultural training from outsiders. I think that would be important. And I appreciated the sergeants talking about defensive tactics in a way to say, you know, you want to use the least you need to do to get to compliance. And then the other thing was getting officers getting back up or walking away if they're just not feeling like they're equipped to deal with the situation. I bring those things up because I think it's important for our community to understand how defensive tactics is approached in the department. And I think, Jimmy, to your point about the transparency, if there's some confidence in our community as a whole that about how defensive tactics are approached, that doesn't mean there's not going to be some times when it could have been handled differently, but it does mean that we will have confidence as a community that our department's going to use the tool in the way that the sergeants described as a way to get compliance in the means that I always call it least lethal. Maybe that's not the right term. They need to get compliance. And there's some, my history with the community, there's some comfort in the community when they know well enough that the public officials or the public servants that are in their community have the community's values, then they're confident in that. And then they're like, no, that just doesn't sound like our police department when somebody is critical. And so if we're transparent and the community understands the values of the department and how we implement these things, I think that's really important. And that's one of the values I've seen in the Public Safety Advisory Board, is to bring these issues forward and have some conversations about it. Thanks.
And Chief McAlpine?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on what's been said so far, and where I've seen where police departments who've had body-worn cameras a little bit longer than us, they do a really good job of putting in subtext to kind of help the viewer either if it's not clear what is being said, the subtext may say so, or just what is happening. And we've also received those videos as training videos that also shed light, because it may be from another state and you may not know everything that's going on. So I think technology will allow us to add some information down below without, altering the video in any such way in its true form. And then the other, back to Jimmy's comment on cultural, it's not cultural, but it is a population of concern. And that is especially with our adult autistic individuals, we are developing a training. We have some training on that, pretty standard boilerplate training, but there is a Tigard resident who wants to provide training to us. She's skilled in this. She has an autistic son. And so we're collaborating with her on, some information that we can give in shift briefings. And if we can get her in pass the COVID restrictions, she'd actually like to, just talk to the officers from the perspective of a parent. So we are trying to look at different ways of doing that, and it's reasonable with cultural and even sexual orientation, gender or orientation, and all that. There's opportunities to make it very specific.
Great. Are there any other comments or questions? If not, we can thank the officers and move on to the next topic on the agenda.
We were going to cover one more thing, actually. That wasn't the
Oh,
last.
okay, sorry.
Sorry, I know we're running late, but this is quick. Supervisor responsibilities during and after the application of force. So as supervisors, which we both are, at the scene, if able, we would go to the scene where force was used. The only thing that would really prevent that is, other priority calls happening. So generally we do go. We ensure medical assistance offered to, the individual that force was used against and the officers. Interview the person who force was used against. Get information about the call and what happened from others on scene. Ensure witnesses are interviewed, and just overall supervise the entire scene in the investigation. We'd collect photographs and evidence. After that, we ensure all reports and documentation are accurate and complete. If there is force used, any officer on scene will write a report. That's our policy. We compile all paperwork and a force data collection report and all audio and video evidence. We as supervisors write and complete a use of force review with all available information, which includes a summary of events, recommendations, and critique if applicable. That packet with all the reports, all the videos, gets forwarded up. It goes to my boss. It then goes to their boss, and then it goes all the way to the chief. And I can tell you from experience, she reads every single one. That was it.
Great. Do we have any other questions for the sergeant? Great. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We have to, thanks for letting us join. We have to leave the meeting and go to work.
Thank you, Sergeants. Thank you for the presentation. It's really well done. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
All right, we're going to go back and go to other topic, which talk about qualified immunity.
One moment, Valerie has her hand raised. Do you have a question, Valerie?
I just have a comment. One of the things that the city council has charged us with is recommendations. And I think that at some point we're likely to have recommendations. I have a couple of points that I'd like for us to talk about with respect to use of force. So I don't know if this is the appropriate time to do that, or if that's something that we should have a broader discussion of next week, because I certainly don't want to intrude on Mr. Lewis's, or not next week, 2 weeks from now. I don't want to intrude on Mr. Lewis's presentation, but I do want us to have a detailed discussion. And I know that we have an agenda that we're trying to move through, but I think this is an area that's critical. So
I would say, should we move that to next meeting for so we have enough time and space for that? That seems an important topic.
Okay.
Is everybody agreeable with that? Do you have a hands up? Thumbs up? Great. Well, looks like we have some thumbs up here.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. And we will move that to our next meeting. I'm going to pass over to Chief to introduce our next speaker, Davis Lewis, if the Chief don't mind introducing David.
Not at all, but one of the joys I get to do is have Shelby do it. But, because she was kind enough to reach out to Dave and ask him to come in here. So Shelby, you want to do that?
Certainly. So the city of Tigard, like most cities in Oregon, is represented by city county insurance services for purposes of tort litigation. And so we have attorneys like Dave who represent us on tort cases. So he has been involved with qualified immunity cases, and he is here tonight to give us his perspective on the issue.
Good evening, and thank you, Shelby. So I'm currently the supervising litigation attorney at City County Insurance Services. City County Insurance is an insurance risk pool where approximately 95% of all Oregon cities and counties, they pool their money into a trust fund, and that's the insurance, and CIS then administers that. I am part of the in-house litigation department. We also have a variety of law firms throughout the state that are private practice that we contract with. I started defending Oregon cities and counties in 1995. It has been my entire career. I started with the Portland City Attorney's Office and then moved to one of those outside law firms that did contract work for CIS. And there was an earlier insurance company called Northland Insurance that defended cities and counties. And then I moved in-house at CIS in 2017. So I've been doing this for quite a while. Most of that litigation is police officer litigation. It is civil defense. I don't get involved in criminal cases. It is when a person called the plaintiff sues a city, sues a police officer for either a violation of their constitutional rights or a what we call a tort, a state law claim like battery or trespass or things like that. So I was asked to come present on qualified immunity. It's been in the news quite a lot lately. So I want to start with what qualified immunity is not. So you've got, if a citizen believes that a police officer or any public official has acted wrongfully against them, they have two avenues. They can sue in federal court for violations of the US Constitution. They can also sue in state court for torts, for a violation of their state statutory rights. They can also bring those claims all in one case. Qualified immunity is only a defense to the federal constitutional claims. It is not a defense at all to state law claims. So let me give you an example. You've just had a defensive tactics instruction. So if someone believes that a police officer used excessive force against them, they can sue under either the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, or they can sue for battery under state law. Qualified immunity is only a defense under the Fourth Amendment. It is not a defense to battery. So we're just going to be focused on the federal law aspect of this. The US Constitution doesn't have its own provision that allowed for suits against public officials. So coming out of the Civil War in 1871, the US Congress passed a law, 42 USC, and USC means United States Code, section 1983, that allowed for lawsuits against public officials for violations of the US Constitution. Now, that was called at the time the Ku Klux Klan Act because of the passage of the 14th Amendment that gave all persons of color the same citizenship rights as other people, as the white people, and that prohibited the government from passing laws that discriminated against them, not giving them equal protection of the laws. Well, for many cities and counties, municipalities, other government entities, particularly throughout the South, they weren't enforcing those laws. And the Ku Klux Klan was running rampant and violating people's rights. And in fact, many of the cities and counties were not only complicit with the Klan, their police chiefs, their mayors were members of the Klan. So Congress passed Section 1983 to allow enforcement against public officials of the US Constitution. Now, at that point, it was only the US government that could take that enforcement action. It wasn't until 1961 that the US Supreme Court extended that right to private citizens to sue under Section 1983. Within a few years of that, the US Supreme Court then granted a defense to public officials who were engaged in discretionary functions. And that's essentially, they were having to make decisions based upon the circumstances they were confronted with. It was their discretion, if you will, for acting in good faith. So they had a defense if they were acting in good faith. Well, the problem with that was good faith was a subjective term. It then depended upon what was in the person's mind. So you could have two people, let's just say a relatively new police officer and a more experienced police officer. They would know different things. They would have different experiences. But if they engaged in the same action, one officer could be in good faith because he or she didn't know any better, and the other officer didn't. And so that one officer would get off, if you will, would have that defense, and the other would not. So the Supreme Court changed that. They made it what we call an objective standard, the reasonable person standard, to avoid these subjective determinations. And so they developed in 1982 the defense of qualified immunity. It changed from the good faith defense to a qualified immunity defense. And what that says is that government officials performing discretionary functions can be shielded from liability from civil damages as long as their conduct doesn't violate clearly established constitutional or federal statutory rights, of which a reasonable person would have known. So they tried to incorporate this reasonable person standard. Now, over the years, that test has been refined, but it's remained essentially the same. So currently, the qualified immunity test is a two-step test. The first step asks whether or not the Constitution was violated. If it was, you go to the second step. If it wasn't, the analysis ends, there's no constitutional violation. So the second step is, if the Constitution is violated, was it clearly established such that a reasonable police officer would understand, a reasonable public official, it applies to all government employees, a reasonable public official would have known that what they were doing violated the Constitution at the time they acted. Now, unfortunately, the Supreme Court said in 2009 that the courts could either take the first step or second step in any order they wanted. They didn't have to go number one, number two. And that led to a lot of criticism, because what was happening is, and in fact, the Supreme Court encouraged the lower courts to think really hard about defining constitutional rights or finding constitutional rights, and skip to the second step. Was it clearly established under current law that such a reasonable person would understand they violated their right? So what happens is the courts go, we're not going to answer the question whether the Constitution was violated or not. We're going to assume it was for the purposes of our discussion, and then just look at clearly established. The problem is that doesn't define constitutional rights. It doesn't help clarify them. So that is one criticism of qualified immunity. So what does clearly established right mean? Again, the Supreme Court has defined that as a right that is sufficiently clear such that every reasonable official would have understood that what he or she is doing violates that right. While you don't have to have the specific same fact scenario in a prior case, the existing precedent case law must have placed the constitutional question beyond debate. So that really is where qualified immunity comes down to, is the question of whether a reasonable public official understood at the time they took the actions that what they were doing was violating the Constitution. It most often arises in the case law, if you will, on use of force cases, because the facts confronting an officer in every situation is different, and different circumstances. And so how an officer decides whether the force that they used is reasonable or excessive is really fact dependent. In 1989, the US Supreme Court, in a famous case of Graham versus Connor, and you'll see this case cited in news reports, said that for purposes of qualified immunity, excessive force should be evaluated from the perspective of the reasonable officer on the scene, that it's not capable of a precise definition, but that it must embody the allowances for police officers who are forced to act, to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. So in the context of civil litigation, you have a citizen who believes that an officer, and I'll just use the excess force analysis. An officer has violated their rights, used excessive force. So they file a lawsuit. The officer then, through my office or through another attorney, defends that lawsuit. At some point, you do discovery, exchange documents, depositions are taken, which means the witnesses, the parties are put under oath, and their stories are told under oath. And then all that's put together, and we file a motion for summary judgment, it's called, which is basically says to the judge, based upon the facts, you have to find either for the plaintiff or for the officer defendant. Now, if there are facts in dispute, it's a jury question. Qualified immunity just doesn't, the judge can't grant qualified immunity. So let's give an example. Let's say a person who's being arrested says, I was just passively resisting, I wasn't fighting back, and I've got 4 officers on the other side saying, oh yes, he was being violent, he was trying to throw punches. The judge has to say, that's a question for the jury, because I have the citizen saying, I didn't do any of that. And I have the officers, and it doesn't matter how many officers, saying, yes, he was. No qualified immunity. That's a question for the jury, whether he was engaging in that behavior, and if so, whether the force was reasonable. So it only applies then where the facts are not in dispute. So the judge then makes a decision whether or not the officer is entitled to qualified immunity or not. If the judge decides no, we've got questions of fact, it goes to the jury. If the judge decides yes, based upon the undisputed facts, it wasn't clearly established that what the officer encountered and the force they used violated the Constitution, the officer has a defense, and he or she is then dismissed from the case. Now, the city or the county, if they're also sued, that defense doesn't apply to them. It only applies to individual public officials. That's kind of the basic backdrop of qualified immunity. So let me give you some examples, case law, to help you understand it. And these are cases from either the US Supreme Court or from the Ninth Circuit, which is our federal appellate circuit for the West Coast. So every case out of Oregon, for example, that gets appealed ends up in the Ninth Circuit.
And David, just so you know, we have a comment or question from Valerie.
Okay.
So if you want to finish up.
I'm sorry, I can't see hands raised.
Yeah, I can, so I just.
Yes.
Just a brief clarification. So you said at the beginning of your presentation that qualified immunity is a defense against a federal constitutional claim, correct?
Correct.
And that the reason that we're able to bring those is because of 42 USC 1983. which gives a cause of action for violations of constitutional standards. Is there, I know that the Oregon Constitution and the federal Constitution are substantially similar in a lot of respects with respect to individual rights. Is there a state level cause of action that would parallel the federal cause of action? And if so, is there a qualified immunity exception as well in the standard state law?
The simple answer is no. There is not a similar Section 1983 under Oregon state law. Our Oregon legislature has never enacted one, so there is no ability for a private citizen to sue for violations of the Oregon Constitution. They can sue for common law torts, battery, trespass, false arrest, things like that, but not for violations of the Oregon Constitution. So there wouldn't be a qualified immunity defense to the state law claim at all at this point.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before I move on to examples? Okay. So Supreme Court case from 2018 called White versus Pauling. Let me tell you the stories. Officers get a report of someone reckless driving when they were seen driving to this property. So the officers go to this property. They approach the house covertly for officer safety. They basically snuck up to the house. The people inside the house heard the officers outside, or rather heard someone outside, and yelled, "Who are you? What do you want?" The officers, thinking it would just be a big joke, laughingly yelled back, "We've got you surrounded. Come out with your hands up." People inside the house, not knowing who was outside, yelled, "We have guns." Officer White pulls up to the scene and gets out of his patrol car just as he hears the home occupants yell, "We have guns." So he drew his weapon and took cover. One of the home occupants came out the back door with a shotgun, fired 2 blasts in the air. Another opened a window and pointed a handgun in Officer White's direction. Officer White returned fire. He didn't. Officer White fired and killed the home occupant. The Supreme Court ruled that Officer White was entitled to qualified immunity for the shooting because clearly established law didn't prohibit an officer from assuming that other officers who had been there before him had followed proper procedures, including identifying themselves. The Fourth Amendment doesn't require an officer to second guess earlier steps made by officers before he arrives on the scene. So he got qualified immunity for the shooting based upon what he experienced when he arrived. The other 2 officers did not, because their actions are what led to this in the first place. 2019 Supreme Court case called Casella versus Hughes. Again, it's a force case, but 3 officers in Tucson, Arizona responded to a 911 call from a neighbor that a woman had a kitchen knife and was behaving erratically. The officers arrived at the residence that was surrounded by a chain link fence and a locked gate. There was a woman standing in the yard separated from the officers by the fence. Another woman, Hughes, then suddenly emerged from the house carrying a large knife at her side and walked toward the first woman, stopping about 6 feet from her. Again, the officers are separated from the yard by this chain link fence. They drew their guns and ordered the woman, Hughes, to drop the knife twice. She didn't even acknowledge their presence or drop the knife. Believing that she was an imminent threat to the other woman standing there, the officers fired, shooting her 4 times through the fence. It turned out the 2 women were roommates, that Hughes had a history of mental illness and acting out to get attention. And the other woman was her roommate and didn't feel threatened or in danger at any time. Now, the Supreme Court said that in that circumstances where the officers had only seconds to act, where you would have one person with a knife who was reported behaving erratically, who ignored their commands to drop the knife mere feet away from another person, and they had no ability to physically get there, that the officers were entitled to qualified immunity for the shooting. It wasn't clearly established under the circumstances they confronted that shooting her would violate her Fourth Amendment. Let's move to the Ninth Circuit. Zion versus County of Orange. So officers are responding to a domestic violence call in an apartment complex. They arrive at the parking lot, get out of their car, and approach one of the suspects believed to be involved. That suspect pulls a knife and stabs the officer, who collapses and then runs away. Another officer arriving at the same time sees the stabbing of an officer, sees the suspect running away, and shoots him 9 times. He drops to the ground in a fetal position. The deputy then runs to where he had fallen and shoots him 9 more times. Then he circles around him before taking a running start and stomping on his head 3 times. The suspect died at the scene. Needless to say, the Ninth Circuit was not impressed. The court ruled that the first 9 shots were justified. An officer is justified at shooting at a suspect in order to end the severe threat to public safety, and they don't have to stop shooting until the threat is ended. So until he was down and it was sure that the threat had ended, those shots were fine. However, the other shots were not, because he was now no longer a threat. And officers are required to justify and go through the process for every use of force, every bullet, every taser trigger pull. And this officer didn't do that. The suspect was no longer a threat when he fired the last 9. And they found that the head stomps, after several seconds of reflection, to be just the sort of brutal conduct that the Constitution forbids. So the officer did not get qualified immunity for the last 9 shots or his brutal head stomps.
I just want to interject for a second because we're getting close to time for the meeting tonight. Does anybody have any questions for David? This is a really nice presentation before we wrap up here on this topic. Jimmy has a question for you or a comment.
Yes, sir.
Just a comment for us, actually. David, thank you very much for this walkthrough. I know we are running out of time. It seems to me that this is something that we definitely need to have discussion about. And if we cannot finish it tonight, which obviously we're not going to, can we at least make this be part of the discussion that occurs when we also have the use of force activity that Valerie mentioned in the coming weeks?
Yes, we can discuss the agenda on that, yes. And Sean had a question or a comment?
Thank you. Thank you for the great presentation. It sure strikes me that there's a large difference between the details of what qualified immunity is and isn't, the perception of what it is and isn't. And it also strikes me too that this really is something that applies to all public officials, not police officers.
Yes, it does.
It probably is a much bigger topic when you think about it in those terms. Thank you.
And Valerie.
So I just wanted to make sure that Mr. Lewis has had an opportunity to complete his presentation, because I want to make sure that, I mean, we've got 15 more minutes, and I think that I'd like to hear whatever else he has to say on the topic.
I just had some more examples, and one example is where the law changed and the officers got qualified immunity because the law changed. They weren't expected to know it, but that's another example. But I can, well, let me just tell that story if we have time then.
Yeah, please.
Yes, please do. I was just trying to make everybody aware of the timing on here. Thank you.
So another Ninth Circuit case from a couple years ago, Short versus Orange County. So Orange County deputies had an arrest warrant for plaintiff's adult son, who they mistakenly thought was living in the plaintiff's house. Plaintiff and his son have the same name. They arrived to execute the arrest warrant and encountered plaintiff in his front yard, and believing him to be the wanted suspect, arrested him and put him in the patrol car. They soon discovered their mistake, that he was the father, not the son, but they kept him in handcuffs in the patrol car because of his argumentative behavior. He sued for false arrest. He also sued for violations of his First Amendment rights. The Ninth Circuit ruled that previously, when officers are executing a search warrant, they're lawfully entitled to detain everybody at the residence. But this was an arrest warrant, not a search warrant. And the courts had never treated arrest warrants and search warrants differently until now. At this point, the Ninth Circuit said arrest warrants are for a specific person, not a location. Therefore, an arrest warrant doesn't give law enforcement the right to detain everybody at the scene. So when they detain the father at the scene, though the law allowed it then, it doesn't anymore. And they got qualified immunity for his detention because they articulated a new law. However, they didn't get qualified immunity for his continued detention in violation of the First Amendment. And again, the facts are important. After the deputies discovered he wasn't the son, wasn't the person who wanted in a warrant, they kept him in the back of the patrol car. He became furious, was swearing, adamantly protested his detention and threatening to sue them. One of the deputies said to him, "If you weren't being so argumentative, we'd let you go." The Ninth Circuit found that violated his First Amendment rights, because what you said to him was, if you weren't exercising your First Amendment rights, we would change the conditions of your confinement. And they didn't get qualified immunity under the First Amendment for continuing to detain him. So that's an example of the law changed. Part of the claims got thrown out on qualified immunity, but others remained in the case. So, any other qualified immunity questions?
I believe, Sean, you had your hand up.
Not intentionally, sorry.
Gabby, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, Tammy, I have a question. So, sorry, I can't raise my hand on my phone. So, Dave, in terms of your experience litigating these cases in Oregon, how often does this come up in your practice? We hear a lot about it on the national news, but how often does it come up in your experience?
Qualified immunity is a defense in virtually all of the police cases. It is a defense that we raise on summary judgment. So I'd say it's fairly extensively litigated. But again, if there are questions of fact, that's for a jury to decide, and the judge can't make a qualified immunity ruling. But it's common in almost all of them.
And so in those cases, how often does the full case hinge on it versus the officer is excused, but the city continues to be the defendant in the case? In other words, how often is it determinative?
So usually a citizen who's suing will bring both federal and state law claims. And the city is named on the state law claims. There might be constitutional claims against the city as well. So if they bring both of those claims, both the state law, I'll just say, if it's an excess force, you got Fourth Amendment excess force and then a state law battery. The battery claims continue afterwards. And we've had lots of trials where qualified immunity got the individual officer out, but the city continued on the battery or the trespass claim.
Chief McAlpine, I believe you had your hand up a moment ago.
Well, it was just more, Dave, if you can speak to kind of, it's nice, besides police chief saying this, the fear that if they just do a blanket away from qualified immunity or parse out law enforcement outside, as we know from all public officials, the sense is that nobody's going to want to do this job. And can you just comment on that train of thought?
So there are bills going in the US Congress to limit qualified immunity. Because it is a defense that applies to every public official, if you just limit it to everyone but police officers, it is going to have an impact on them. Oregon is somewhat unique, and perhaps the West Coast is, in that we have officers are defended and indemnified by their city. That is not true in a lot of parts of the country. Other parts of the country, officers are required to get their own insurance. Other parts of the country, officers, if they're found to be liable, their city or county doesn't cover them. So we're a little different out here. If qualified immunity goes away, it means we go to trial more, potentially. But because Oregon state law requires the defense and indemnity of public officials acting in the course and scope of their employment, I don't think it would have a huge impact here in Oregon. A lot of parts of the country it would. We don't have that.
Thank you.
I mean, I will say too, though, it is becoming harder to recruit police officers, and particularly if they know that even though I'm trying to do the right thing, I was faced with a circumstance that was uncertain, it was tense, and I have to make split-second decisions, but a judge or jury is going to take 2 weeks to decide what I had to decide in seconds. That has a detrimental impact on their mental health, as well as the ability to get qualified people to come into this line of work. So it will have that impact, potentially.
Yeah, we're seeing that already without the removal of qualified immunity. So
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments for David or questions? Jimmy.
So again, this is the comment. And the comment of it's hard to find individuals who are interested in doing police work juxtapositions the importance of training of officers. Because if we work toward effectively training officers, whether it's about the process of qualified immunity, that's only one piece of police work. You know, probably the vast majority, and I can't say I'm 100% sure on this, but my sense is the vast majority of their work isn't necessarily focused on elements of qualified immunity. That's just one piece of the work that they are doing. And so if we shrug our shoulders and say, we can't find good police officers because of the qualified immunity piece, then I think it's incumbent upon the recruiters to talk about the importance of police work beyond qualified immunity. That to me is what we should be focusing on then if we are looking at recruitment. That's a comment.
Great comment. I think it's about time to wrap up now. I apologize, everybody. We had such great discussion tonight that we didn't have an opportunity to discuss current events, but I think we have a lot of discussion for upcoming meeting agendas as well. Is there any other comments with that if we take up in our next meetings continuation of these two topics from this evening? Are people in agreement with that?
I think Sean's got his hand up.
Oh, sorry, Sean. Thank you. Sean, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I was gonna wait, but okay. Well, I do think that recruiting police officers and keeping police officers is a important function of our local government for community safety. But at the same time, I think another topic is how well do our police officers perform, in any community as far as putting themselves at risk to go out and engage and go to the tough places and help prevent crime with proactive approach, or do they retreat and be less proactive and we see crime go up, and so that affects our neighborhoods, it affects our schools. And I think that's a larger community question that affects our community, that if we're going to talk about one thing, we need to talk about the other side, the possible impacts in the future. Things have already changed quite a bit in Oregon since my family moved here when I was a kid 40 plus years ago. So we see these changes and you just wonder, well, what will a policy today, what legislation gets passed today that has these long-term impacts that we don't realize right now? So anyways, just my thoughts, my 2 cents. Thank you.
And we have 2 more minutes till the meeting comes to adjourn, but I see, Jeff, that you have your hand up. One last minute, and then we're going to have to ask for the meeting to come to adjourn. So Jeff, if you have a moment.
Yeah, thanks. I'll make it quick. I think this is more just like a high level comment. Let's see. So I work for one of the big, sports industry companies out here. And just an example, like if this company I work for is trying to be sustainable, it's up to the leadership and every employee to use sustainability as their first filter in every decision they make. And whether that's materials, production, to employees commuting and the workspaces and what that looks like across the entire company. Tigard and the PSAB's goal is to eliminate institutional racism, center racial equity and justice, and improve the lived experience of everyone in Tigard. And after 17 meetings, it still seems like we're reliant on community members to bring up racial justice, to bring up equity, transparency, and accountability. Eventually, PSAB will be done. And so in order for the city to meet this goal, I think we need the department to come with their discussions and their presentations with equity, transparency, and accountability as their first filter, to come with gaps and opportunities